go. How are you going today, man?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yeah, beautiful day.
It is a beautiful day. We got lucky.
Yeah, got some training in, some
Nice.
coaching, and yeah, now we're here, so can't complain.
Very good. All right, Michael. I want to get just like a bit. Am I too loud? No, that's. There we go. Now I'll be less loud. This is better. I struggle hearing myself a bit sometimes.
Okay.
I want to get just into some jiu-jitsu talk with you.
Sure.
So first up, how did you get into jiu-jitsu?
Well, originally I was doing Muay Thai when I was like a teenager, a bit younger, maybe 13, 14 I started that. And I took that, well actually before that, as a kid I did karate, but it wasn't very serious, I suppose, like once a week, whatever. I always liked the idea of martial arts, and yeah, and I got into Muay Thai. I took that progressively more seriously, and I had always had the idea that I'd like jiu-jitsu, I like grappling, just from what I'd heard about it, watching mixed martial arts and whatever else. And then I think at a certain point I knew that if I wanted to take Muay Thai seriously, I'd have to do a lot of hard sparring, and I wasn't willing to take the consequences of like lots of getting hit in the head, frankly. And I also thought the idea of jiu-jitsu was a little bit more technical, at least in terms of how many techniques there are, and that's always interested me. And then, yeah, a Ruta team opened up at a new location, thought I'd check it out, and
Is that where they're at now?
same place,
Yeah.
and the rest was history. And yeah, just started training, probably, like a lot of people, once or twice a week to begin with, and progressively I just added more and more sessions to it. But I think I was maybe uniquely, I knew as soon as I started it'd be something that I'd be committed to, more or less. And since then it's just been more training. I've always been interested in the technical aspect of it, and yeah, see where I can take it.
Yeah, nice. I can totally understand the aspect of not wanting to do the hard sparring that comes with Muay Thai.
Yeah.
I have done it for a little bit, and same thing, like it's a pretty brutal sport.
It is, there's no denying it, yeah.
And I can only assume that the same way that you would get better at it would be the same way you get better at jiu-jitsu, which involves you actually drilling and practicing, which involves you getting your butt, you're getting hit quite a lot. So I always admire people when they do decide to stick to Muay Thai, because there is that consequence of definitely getting hit quite hard.
For sure, and with grappling, I think one of the real pluses that you can train as hard as you want, more or less, and not get at least head trauma. There may be other physical consequences. I guess my ideas have changed on that from both ends a little bit since, though. I don't think you need to really spar extremely hard, maybe ever, really. Like every now and then, especially if you're a competitor. But I think day in, day out, you should be keeping training a little bit more playful, and it's a little bit less wear and tear on the body. And I think that could probably apply to Muay Thai as well. But those were my ideas at the time. Yeah.
Now, I think there's a lot of value in what you just said, but maybe let's expand on that a little bit, because
Sure.
let's say somebody's listening to this, they're maybe newer to jiu-jitsu. That can be like a hard thing to understand. So when you say keep it playful, what does that mean? Maybe like on a very technical sense. So how would somebody approach? Okay, I've got a training, I go to an open mat. What would that mean?
Yeah. So I think most people would start training, and they would, when getting into live training, like sparring, they would think the goal is to win, right? And I think that was definitely a mindset I had when I started. But I think the more the culture allows for, and the more you think yourself that the goal is not so much to win, but to develop skills, then I think you'll start to realize that a lower intensity is often beneficial to that. And I think if you can change your value structure a little bit when you reflect on a role you've done, if you think, did I win on points or submission, versus do you think, did I work the technique I had in mind, or was I developing skills that I previously had not had developed? I think if you can switch to that mindset, then in the long term you'll become better at grappling, in my opinion. I think too many people have fallen into the trap of they find what works for them, and then they stick to that, and they never stray from that, because if they ever try anything else, they lose the round. But they only lose the round if they're thinking that winning on points or submission is winning the round. But if they think about the round or the live training in terms of, was I working on a skill which I had in mind, and did I get better at that skill? That might even be mount escapes, for example. So you're going to get mounted a lot if you're working mount escapes. And did you get the repetitions that you were looking for? Did you get attempts at the technique you were trying? Is more how I would frame, did I have a successful roll? And I think the problem with playful training comes from you need somewhat of a cooperative training partner. So I would frame jiu-jitsu training at least as collaboration, and in collaboration there's competition and cooperation, if that makes sense. So it's not pure competition, it's not pure cooperation, which might be drilling, it's some mix of the two. I think the more you develop training relationships and a good culture in your gym, the more you'll be able to collaborate with your training partners and keep it playful. That's not to say you're not trying to beat each other, it's just to say that your values are pushed a little bit further into technical development rather than winning.
And from what I observe, maybe some of the things that stop people from having that playful, I guess, role, for example, just from like a personal experience, I guess when you first start, you're trying to prove yourself like in the culture, right? So you're just trying to say like, look, I'm tough enough, right? Like, or you want some sort of like acknowledgement from the coach because you don't know yet like how well you're progressing. So you think, oh, maybe if they give you a nod like at the end, then you're like doing well. So, and because you don't have that skill set, that's the only tool that you rely on. So if you were like a white belt listening to this,
yeah,
and you don't have that many skills yet,
sure,
would being playful in the role just try and do the technique that you've just learned?
That's a good question. I think inevitably, as a white belt, you're going to have a smaller tool set, and you're going to have to try harder to successfully use that tool set. So I think at the end of the day, the reality is it's harder to be playful as a beginner than it is to be playful as an expert. And same goes for the training partner you're versing. So I think what's really valuable to beginners, if you want to purely progress, is, I would say, positional training allows for a lot more playful rolling. So say I'm working some sort of guard, maybe single leg X. I think it's hard to work single leg X as a beginner, or maybe ever, in an open round, because maybe it's not your strong suit, and as soon as you enter it, you get passed, and then you've lost maybe 3-4 minutes of the round to being in bottom out. As opposed to if you're doing positional rounds where each time you start at a single leg X, you'll just get more repetitions. And say the round is set up so that if your opponent passes you, then you switch, they're on the bottom and they start in single leg X. Then at least that way you can try something. You might fail, but at least you know that you'll just reset back to single leg X in the opposite perspective, they'll give it a go, and then you'll be able to go back to that position again. And I think the hesitance to try something new is lowered if they're doing positional training. So I would recommend positional training a lot of the time to beginners and to all skill levels.
Nice. Now, if you are listening as like a beginner in jiu-jitsu, would you say that's the first thing that you should kind of like be establishing for yourself, like just understanding the positions, working from them? Like, I know that when you first start, you probably don't look at jiu-jitsu that way, or you probably think, well, I need to learn to do some attacks. Right?
Sure.
Do you think one of the mistakes that often beginners make, where they just maybe put emphasis on, I need to learn submissions, like I need to learn how to do an armbar or do a choke, instead of realizing that the positions are actually, you need that position to even be able to do the submission.
Yeah, so again, it's a good question. I don't think there's a black and white answer to it, in the sense that the main thing I emphasize above all else is maintaining enthusiasm towards training. And if you're only practicing bottom mount escapes, which might honestly be the best way to get good quickly, is just practicing bad positions, it's not fun. And you're not learning what you're probably drawn to, which is maybe a triangle or maybe some sort of submission or a cool sweep or something. So I think you do need to find a balance between practicing what excites you. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but also understanding what will have value throughout your entire career in Jiu-Jitsu. And I think it's the role of the coach to make sure you get the things that will never lose their value, such as just learning elbow escapes from side control and from mount, and learning back escapes, and learning just how to control someone. But I think there's nothing wrong with getting pulled in the directions that excite you to some degree as well. So I think that it's a bit of both really, but if purely you're interested in getting good and nothing else and you're just beginning, I would definitely recommend working your pin escapes. Yeah, but it's not fun, frankly. Yeah, and so I think you need a bit of both.
I think that's some very valuable information there. Now, we live in a time where we can be flooded with information, and we have it very accessible. When you're beginning, how much of your time should be divided between just learning what you're being taught at the gym? And the reason why I say this is, like, I'm a slow learner when it comes to jiu-jitsu. So I feel like I can learn one technique probably for the month, and like it would take me a while to get it.
Sure.
But then I talk to other people, and they've like bought 27 instructions.
Yeah.
And like I couldn't learn that way, but I do know that lots of people do. They do that. They digest a lot. They're like, oh, I'm trying to learn this thing that I saw on Instagram, and I'm trying to learn this instructional, and I'm trying to fit that in with the curriculum that my coach is trying to teach. How should somebody who's newer to training be able to manage all that? Should they even try to, or should they just stick to what the coach is showing?
Yeah, well, I think it does depend on your thoughts on the situation you're in. Maybe there's only one gym in town and there's one coach, and you might feel that they're giving you extremely valuable information. You might feel that they're not. And I think part of it just comes down to your own critical assessment of the situation. But it also comes down to your learning style. Some people, I think, learn much more intuitively and they have to just do it live. Some people can just, like a lecture, watch an instructional and understand what's going on, and they may be able to more or less implement that straight away. I think the main mistake or the main oversight that people have is the idea of learning something there and then. I see jiu-jitsu, and probably most pursuits, as more cyclical than that. I don't think you just learn something and then move on. I think you've got to come to terms with the fact that it's a long-term project, and you're going to learn it partially, and you're going to move on because there's many other positions to explore, and then you're eventually going to come back to that position if it's important, and you build on your previous context. So I don't think people should get completely married to this idea that they need to understand all there is to understand about whatever topic they're learning right there and then. Learn as much as you can, and if your coach has set up the program in a reasonable manner, or if you're setting up your own program in a reasonable manner, then you will circle back to that. The mount and back and some of the closed guard, they're never going to go entirely out of fashion, and you've just got to accept that it's a long-term project, and you will circle back to these positions, and don't feel discouraged if you don't feel like you've walked away from the class with the position nailed.
When you're starting out, maybe even like at the stage that I've been training for 4 years, how should you divide your training between doing things like just sparring rounds, like doing open mats, versus classes or drilling in class, for example?
Sure. I divide learning a technique up by degrees of resistance. So like I was saying, I kind of break up the cooperative aspect and the competitive aspect. So I would start with the most cooperative, which is just drilling. Your training partner more or less just completely lets you do whatever technique you're practicing. And then from there, I'd like to move on to a sort of live drilling scenario where there's some resistance. And I would say this is the most difficult in the sense that your training partner has to be the appropriate amount of cooperative and the appropriate amount of competitive. And then I'd go to positional training, where there's a really isolated position, but you are both trying to win. And then from there, we can carry those skills into live training. I think there's kind of a threshold you have to reach for a certain technique before you can practice it just in live rounds. And if you never reach that threshold, you'll never passively improve at that skill. So you've got to make sure you at least can enter the position against a resisting opponent in just a live round. You can find your way there. And if you can't, I think it's time to take a back step and do some positional rounds where you start there, or you start in a context where it's easier to enter that position, and then until you can get to that position against a resisting opponent, then you probably won't get better at it in just live open rounds. So I would just generally start with drilling, then add a little bit of resistance to that, then do positional training that relates to that technique or position, and then when you feel more comfortable there, you can take it into pure open rounds.
Would there be a time where somebody just doing sparring rounds without really any goal, like plateau their ability to progress?
I believe so, but it's dependent on the practitioner. Yeah, I think some people you could just throw into a room of extremely competent practitioners, and they'll just via osmosis pick up techniques, and they'll just get better. And some people, they'll really struggle to do that. They need a bit more of a dot point layout of what they should be doing. They need a little bit more direction. So I think ultimately, yes, I believe that you need to focus your training a little bit more than just live sparring rounds, 6-minute rounds, put on the clock, let's go for whatever, an hour. I think that will yield less results. I give the analogy of, say, a soccer team. They may train 90 minutes, which is the length of a soccer game. They may train 6 times a week, but they're not playing a game of soccer when they train those 6 times a week. They're picking a scenario they need to work on, and they're adding repetitions to that over and over, a defensive scenario, an offensive scenario, whatever it is. And I always try and look at more developed sports than jiu-jitsu, which is frankly quite a young sport, for inspiration as to how the very best get better. And I don't think just showing up and doing an entire game of soccer for I'm no soccer coach, but just as an analogy, I don't think that's the most efficient way to get good. Yeah, and I think the same applies to jiu-jitsu. If you're working maybe front headlock attacks, then you could spend 15 minutes in a training session purely in the front headlock position. You get a lot of different looks, and you'll be there over and over again if you've set up the training that way. Whereas if you just did rounds, and maybe you've trained for 25 minutes for just open rounds, you might end up there twice. And there's no way that you'll get as good at it in that amount of time. And you'll be incentivized to just fall into the grooves of your most comfortable positions and not explore and not find other positions that suit you.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying there. The next question I had was in relation to when you're first starting out, how should you view the progression of the belts? Because I know that's something that when you first start, that's probably the main question you have.
Definitely, people are concerned with it.
Yeah, and as you do it more, you realize one of the things that I really like about jiu-jitsu is that you just accept, like starting it, you just understand it's a long journey.
Yeah.
And as you do it more, you just understand that, and you go it's too long to really care about, things come as they come, right?
Sure.
But when you're first starting, I remember that feeling of just this white thing, I gotta have something more. My friend started karate, he's already a black belt, it's been 2 years, I've still got this white thing around me. How should beginners look at belts? Yeah,
belts. It's always going to be a question, and ultimately I do like belts, but I do think they have some downsides. I think the classic example that is always going to pop up to show the deficiency of belts is a kid's been training since he's 6 years old, he gets to 18, 19, and they're a blue belt, and they've been training for years, and they're going to be better than the average blue belt because they've trained longer. I think now I view belts as, I think the first thing to understand is that belts are not an absolute measurement of skill. It's very difficult to do that. I would argue impossible to say that there is a standard for blue belt, there is a standard for purple belt. I don't think it'll ever really work that way. I think it's relative to your gym, the general skill level. I think you could probably put some dot points about what a blue belt should know. They should know all the basic techniques, they should know all the basic escapes, and I think that will more or less carry them through to a blue belt level. But ultimately, I think it's a token of the time you've put in to the sport and mainly to the gym and culture that you're a part of. I think that's ultimately what people measure themselves against, especially hobbyists, you know, which I have a lot of respect for hobbyists. I don't mean that in an insulting way or anything. I think they're ultimately going to compare themselves against other blue belts or other purple belts in their gym, and I think getting a decent standard there is what's most important. But if you're a white belt and you're thinking about your blue belt, it's easier said than done, but I would say just trust the process of improvement. The belts will come, and really they're a marker for your own personal growth and not a marker of your absolute skill.
Do you see that as the sport has progressed, that not the I'm just going to say it in my terms,
Sure.
but maybe the relevance of like the skill level associated to a belt has changed?
Yes.
Yeah, because I don't know, just from what I witness or see or have rolled with, like, you just see that as, especially as maybe there's more of a competitive scene, like a very competitive blue belt probably can be a black belt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've seen it. Yeah, and that's not to diminish, in my opinion, that doesn't diminish the legitimacy of the black belt. It might say honestly something about the blue belt, like maybe we just need to push people quicker. If somebody trains twice a week versus somebody training 8 times a week, theoretically they should get their belt way quicker, but it doesn't usually happen that way. So I have no problem with, maybe when I open a gym one day, of just giving belts quicker to the people who put in far more time. And I think that'll settle these issues a little bit. But I think 100%, especially with instructionals, the sport is growing, the sport is developing at a very fast rate, and I think in another 5 years the same thing will happen, where people who were a certain belt level during a certain era will not be able to compete with the same belt level in future eras. And that's just, to me that's great. That means the sport's developing and progressing. And yeah, I think the standard is changing. I think.
Yeah, nice. We're going to take a quick break.
Sure.
We're going to come back and we're going to keep chatting to you, Michael.
Awesome.
And we are back. All right, you recently went to Austin.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
It was great. I went to train under John Danaher, who I would say, at least as a coach, is someone who's has a huge influence on me. And I wanted to see what the standard of coaching was like, who I consider to be the best coach in the world, at least from what I've seen and the results that he's gotten. And I wanted to see what the level was like for the practitioners who are really taking it seriously, and the culture of jiu-jitsu in a much more concentrated city of jiu-jitsu. It was a great experience. I think I learned a lot from it. I took a lot away from it. Part of what I took away from it all was that I think a small group of dedicated people can achieve greatness. I don't think there's an absolute necessity for people to leave where they're at. There's obviously contexts where it's probably a smart move, but I think if you have a small group of dedicated people, you can achieve all the same things that the people over there are achieving. But it was good to see the methods that John Danaher taught with, and how much technique he taught in a session, how concentrated the sessions were. Did he follow a whole week of one topic? Did he not? How much positional training was there? How much live training, just sparring was there? All these questions I had wondered myself, so it was good to see that from a personal perspective. And also it was nice I'd been coaching before that, and so it was nice to go over there and just purely be a student for a few months. That was a nice change, but it also made me realize how much I missed coaching. So I would say, like, Austin's a great place. I think one of the greatest benefits of going there as a jiu-jitsu practitioner is just the opportunity for competition and exposure. Of course, the training's fantastic. There's a lot of high-level practitioners floating around, but really what's there is lots of opportunity.
Yeah, nice. All right, you made this super easy for me, Michael, because you actually kind of gave me all the questions that I was going to ask you, which I appreciate. But what was the main thing that surprised you about, let's say, the atmosphere of being like in that sort of John Danaher type setting?
Main thing that surprised me.
Was there something that surprised you?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me, I've learned a lot from his instructionals, but when he coaches a room, he's much less concerned about giving every single detail. And that's something I've definitely taken away from my experience over there. I think, again, it's trusting that you're going to come back to a lot of these topics eventually anyway, so there's no real need to get every single detail out when he teaches it. And I know that the details are there if he wants to give them, and he's just kind of brushing over them, because I've seen him teach them in a more long-form context. And so when I came back to coaching in Adelaide, that's definitely something I took on board. Before going, I felt like I need to teach every detail to this technique that I know, otherwise someone's going to go home, they're going to be missing a detail, and they're going to say, Michael didn't teach me that, the technique doesn't work. But I think I've come back with a little bit more confidence that coaching is, again, a long-term project, and we will get to it eventually. And I think that's something I picked up from it. The other thing is that there was lots of positional training. Lots and lots of positional training. And also that the people who achieve a lot in the sport, they're not as special or unreachable as you think. They're enthusiastic people who are dedicated to getting good and they show up every single day. And of course some of them have talents, but I think people underestimate the level of talent they have themselves and how to facilitate that. So yeah, overall it was a kind of grounding experience. Like you get in the mindset of, oh, they're the guys over in Austin, they're just doing something completely different to what we're doing over here. But I think with the right focus, that can be reached from wherever you are.
That's all. I really love film. I should give that context.
Sure.
Like old films. And one of the films, the analogies in film that I really like is the Wizard of Oz one. Right? There's no wizards, right?
Yeah.
You look behind the curtain, it's just a small man.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times in life we almost want there to be something. Like we want the special person at the top to be special.
Yeah.
And you might often realize, like when you meet them or whatever, that, oh, it is just a person.
Yeah.
It's made out of flesh and bone and blood, just like me. And
Yeah.
and you can take two things away from that. Like you can take away, oh fuck, like maybe I'm not good enough, that's why I haven't made it. Or you can take away the opposite and be like, well, that means there's a chance. Like if they did it, like, maybe I could do it too.
Definitely. Yeah, I think in some ways these people were remarkable, but not remarkable from some unachievable standpoint. I think they're remarkable because you realize they put so much time into this, and before they put lots of time into this, they were bad at jiu-jitsu or at coaching, whatever it might be, and then they've put the time in, and that's the main thing that has separated beginners from experts. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I think the more you realize that, the more you truly believe in an embodied sense that you can achieve what they've achieved.
Yeah, for sure. How much sparring do they do, like over there, compared to like maybe how close classes are generally doing over here?
Yeah, so I went to a few different gyms. I went to Vanguard in Long Island with Jason Rao, who's another person who I've admired for a long time. And they do a turtle round, they do closed guard round, and then they do live open 5-minute rounds. And they'll probably do maybe 4 of those, so probably like 6 rounds all up. And then when I trained at Henzo's in Austin, they did 3 rounds, but they could be anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes each. Yeah. And so the structure was a little bit different. I would say with Danaher at Henzo's, there was a greater emphasis on the technique that's being taught versus just sparring by training. There was still great techniques being taught at Vanguard as well, but it was probably a bit more what people are used to in terms of the allocation of time.
Yeah. How did you find the level of talent over there?
Yeah, there was a big variance in the level of talent. I think, again, the people who showed up every day were very good. I think the people who trained in these places versus a lot of people who were also training in the same places, and so it's like hard to get things going because everyone knows what everyone else knows, more or less. But then you go to a different gym in the same city and you realize how much you actually are progressing. When you're progressing alongside someone, it's hard to see your development sometimes. You need to kind of take a step out of that environment to see how much you progressed in that time. Say Jason Morale he beat me up very easily. So it was an eye-opening experience how good someone can really be at jiu-jitsu. I loved it, to be honest, in the sense that I like problem solving during training, and it's nice to see where the bar is for someone who's considered world class. But yeah, there was the whole range of skill levels. It's not. I think the first time I went to Sydney West, there was a good experience to me because I had been working leg locks in a way that I had never touched to that point, and so like even the guys who were a lower level than me, maybe overall, could still submit me in a round. But once you start to realize what needs to be worked on and what deficiencies you have, what strengths you might have, I think it levels the playing field quite a bit. But yeah, the guys who were really good over there were profoundly good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really good for people to hear, that even in a city like that you will have those discrepancies in skill sets.
For sure. Yeah, and I think honestly in any training room, it's important to have a diversity of skills, because I think even the practitioners who are really good most of the time should be training with people not as good as them, because it's hard to get anything going against someone who's equally as good as them. So I think having a diversity of skill is actually a good thing, and I don't think you'd ever want only the absolute very best to train with. I think it would make it more difficult to improve.
That's definitely one thing that I noticed. Like, I feel like I can only speak from my journey in jiu-jitsu, and like for me it's purely a hobby that I just really like, so I don't spend too much time like overthinking it. But
sure.
I noticed that at the start it's really hard because you don't know anything and people can beat you up, and then you get like a little bit of a skill set. Once you get like past a certain threshold, it feels a lot easier to advance, because now you can actually apply what you learn in class, because you can you can choose to practice with somebody who's less skilled, and you start noticing that progression starts, like it speeds up so much.
Definitely.
As soon as you get past that little hump, you now know the position, so it's not just like the coach has shown me this thing and I don't even understand like how to put my body. You're like, okay, yeah. I know how to put my body in that position, I just need to learn how to do the position well now. So how much of your time, if you're in a room, should you divide between spending your percentage of doing the rounds with people who are better than you, and spend your time doing the rounds with people who are worse than you, so you can practice better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's something called the zone of proximal development, where you want to be outside of your comfort zone, in the unknown, as it were, but you don't want to be too far outside of your comfort zone. I don't think there's much value if you're a complete beginner rolling with Jason Rao. He's going to more or less do whatever he wants. It's too easy for him and it's too difficult for you. So I think there is a middle ground that you should almost always be in. I think the majority of the time, honestly, in terms of just a pure improvement perspective, I think you want to be training with people slightly worse than you. Yeah, I think especially people who are slightly worse than you but are still playing the game, as it were. They're still trying to do jiu-jitsu, because you will get more opportunities to successfully hit the technique that you're trying to hit, but they'll still be giving you good looks. So I think if you want to break it up as, all right, I'm rolling this person with that person, what should I be focusing on? If you're rolling someone who's worse than you, practice your offense. And if you're rolling someone who is better than you, practice your defense. I think if that gap gets too big, then you won't be able to practice either. If they're too much better than you, your defense is not going to work and you won't even be able to practice it. If they're too much worse than you, then you can do more or less sloppy offense and still have success. You're not going to get good feedback. So I would say if you were to divide in an ideal world, I would train with people slightly worse than you, probably 60 to 70% of the time. People your level for like 20% of the time. Yeah, and then people much better than you for 10% of the time. If they're way better than you, it's good to get a look at where you're at, but if you want to develop your skills every single day, then people around your level but slightly worse than you, I think, is the optimal training partner.
Nice. How have you found the transition from being a student into a coach? Do you look at jiu-jitsu differently?
Yeah, I think that the student and the coach have different roles, and acknowledging that is best for both parties. So I think, there's a lot of people who have just been competitors their whole life and they think, what am I going to do next? I may as well coach. But I think at the end of the day, they have different roles, and I do miss out to some degree on improving myself by focusing on being a coach. It's a different skill set that I have to focus on. So there were some growing pains where maybe I'm not rolling quite as much during every class as I thought. And from a competitive perspective, from an ego perspective, honestly, it's like I've learned some of these things that I'm teaching over the course of a year or two, and now I'm giving them to the people I'm teaching in a month or hopefully less. And so it's kind of a hard pill to swallow that these guys that I'm coaching will be better than me one day. But until I can accept that, I won't be a good coach. That's my goal at the end of the day, make them better at a quicker rate than I was able to improve. I think as a student, I was always very self-guided anyway. I'd do my own kind of research, I'd focus my own things in training, and I always had more of an inclination, more of an interest in the technical side of jiu-jitsu anyway, rather than the competition side. So for me, it's a good fit, and it's something that I'm happy to be doing.
As a competitor now, how much should you be paying attention to the trends of what people are doing in competition? Now, as someone who doesn't like competing and doesn't love that side of it, I do notice that it seems like people fall into little trends. Like it seems like wrestling becomes popular, so more people try and wrestle, or leg lock become popular and more people try and do them. So you're guiding your own training with your coach. Like, how much should you be bothered by those things or be aware of them, or just be focusing on your own lane?
Yeah, I think there are some things that won't change. And I think recognizing that what won't change is the quickest way to get good over the long term. The back is a perfect example. I think the back will always be around. The rear naked choke will always be the number one submission. It's the most sort of asymmetrical dominant position. So I think you could more or less guarantee that that's something that is worth working on. You can't guarantee that some of the more subtle entrances to leg locks that are going around are going to be the go-to leg lock entrance in 6 months, let alone 5-10 years. So there is a balance to be struck there, especially if you're at the highest level. You need to know what the meta is, what's going on at the high levels. But I think you see this with the best practitioners. Many of them eventually circle back to just being good chest-to-chest passes, good back takers. You need good wrestling, you need good guard retention, and most of all, you need good escapes. And those things will never go out of fashion, and those are the things which should be most important to you. But there's no denying that falling behind the modern approach, especially now where there's so much information and so much being developed, can have negative results. So you have to, it's a strange thing to balance. I'm not sure exactly the answer myself yet. And I think in the meantime, I know that good fundamental jiu-jitsu won't go out of fashion, and I'll focus on that until I've made my mind up about how valuable these modern techniques are. And I think if you get good enough and you understand jiu-jitsu as a whole, then I think you'll be able to sort of from first principles figure out whether a technique is here to stay or whether it's a trick that's waiting to be countered. And I think it comes down to personal analysis as to which one that is, and I think the best coaches and the best students will recognize what to put their time into and what not to. I know that's not a surefire answer from any given situation, but I think just developing an expert intuition on these matters is really the answer. But focusing on the fundamentals will never go out of fashion.
Yeah. One of the things that prompted that question was, and I'm going to stereotype like a bunch of different conversations to get to my point. But from my understanding, like let's say some of the more old school Brazilian instructors probably dismissed leg locks when they first came in.
Yep.
Would I be correct in saying that?
Definitely.
Yeah. But now that I've seen that as a whole, everyone can do them, they actually don't come up as often as probably they did for a while. Would I be correct in saying that as well?
Yeah. There's, at the highest level, there's still a very prominent submission percentage, but I think they're much harder to get now than they were a few years ago.
Yeah. So is that like not to say that like leg locks are a trick, but would that be something that maybe quasi falls in that category where it's really important to have the knowledge of, but once people are aware of them, they're not as easy to get. If somebody's never seen a leg lock, it's very easy to heel hook them.
Definitely.
But once somebody gets an understanding of it, it becomes like a hard position to get into, a hard position to manage. It becomes more and more tricky to try and, whereas I have seen that maybe with some of the higher level competitors or just across competitions, there are the things that maybe just seem to be more prevalent across the largest space of time, like controlling the back for your choke, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the old school coaches and the dismissal of leg locks and this kind of thing, I think there's a bit of I think you can break that up in a way that I don't think many of them would have ever dismissed the idea of, say, a single leg X being at the very top of the hierarchy of guard positions. But then they've just dismissed the extra step of using that fantastic guard to attack in a way that previously was not there. And I think a big part of it was just reaping is illegal. Heel hooks were not in fashion in anything other than like ADCC. And there's no such thing as heel hooks in gi, or they're not allowed. So there was a cultural bias there, I think, in terms of just the way the sport had been set up to that moment. But yeah, like I said, the leg entanglement itself, I don't think people would disagree that has ever been not valuable. It's always been valuable. Then the heel hook itself was just an addition to that was dismissed. But at a certain point, it had to be accepted. There was just too much success. It was too powerful. I think ultimately, these new positions, they will become harder to get because people will be aware of them, or these new submissions, or these new techniques. But they will settle into their place in the sport, and they will have a context. For example, with heel hooks. Heel hooks, one of the easiest way to defend a heel hook is to sit to your butt and start pummeling your legs. But you've given up something by sitting to your butt. You've lowered your level, you've made your base your hips, and it's much easier to sweep a person who's sitting down than who's over the top of you. And so heel hooks, I think, will always have value, though it might be not immediately visible in the technique that was hit. So someone might threaten a heel hook, the other person, the defending player, sits down to defend that, and the person who attacked originally just stands up and they get an easy sweep. And sweeps will always be around as well, and the threat of the heel hook is what facilitated that. So although you might not see the original technique that sort of took the world by storm, it will find its place, I think, in the sport in a context that suits it.
Do you think that there's something right now that is taking the place of like maybe what heel hooks did a few years ago? Like, is there like something that you're noticing that is coming up, or a certain position maybe wasn't favoured for a long time that now is being favoured? Or exploited, probably being the more right word.
Yeah, I think definitely heel hooks are still kind of in that category. I think they're still being figured out. Leg entanglements are so sophisticated that there's new entrances like K-guard got popularised, and backside 50 was shown as such a good finishing position. So definitely leg locks are still on that trajectory of being discovered and exploited maybe even. But other than that, there's like arm saddle positions that I see a lot more of nowadays, but really I think most of the broad categories of jiu-jitsu have been discovered. It's the nuances within those broad categories that are being innovated at the moment. Yeah, so I don't see anything generally that I think, wow, that's entirely new. It's usually a familiar enough position and an entirely new approach to that familiar position. But I'll always hopefully try and keep my mind open to innovation, and hopefully I can figure out whether I see value in it or not just from first principles and competition results. I can't deny that. But no, I don't see anything. Say we look at the last ADCC. There's, I think, being good at attacking turtle is going to get you a lot of success. Being good at attacking leg locks is going to get you a lot of success. And I think that the big guys who can play guard and the small guys who can play top position, they're having success at the moment. And of course there's that's not always the case, but people who, bigger guys generally favour being on top, and I think if a big guy can truly learn how to play guard, he's going to give a lot of people a lot of problems, and vice versa for small people. But yeah, I haven't seen anything that I think is brand new. Just always keeping my eyes out for what's going on.
Yeah, nice. Well, Michael, it's the 45-minute podcast, and we've made it just past the 45-minute mark. So thank you so much for coming on.
No worries, pleasure to be here.
If people want to find you, where can they do so?
Just on Instagram, Michael Heliotis, and that's about it really. I don't have the biggest social media presence, but if you want to find me in person, I teach at a routine. I teach the noon no-gi classes, and I teach a complete control martial arts. I teach morning and noon no-gi classes there as well. And I'd love to see you in person. We can talk about jiu-jitsu, and yeah, that's it.
Nice. Thanks so much for listening in, crew. I'll put Michael's details on the podcast link description, so make sure to check them out there, and hopefully we'll have you on the show again.
Beautiful, love to be here.